So this is an IEU lunch talk. It's our monthly event, and thank you, Joe, for hosting again. And here we invite experts in the field of climate change and evaluation to share knowledge and experience. And today we're going to talk with Dr. Joseph Intsiful and also Joe Puri, who you both know, about early warning and climate information services. This session is 1 hour, so we have to have 20 minutes in presentation, 20 to 30, and then a little bit of speaking, and then leave some time for questions and answers at the end. So I will moderate that. So today's topic, the wicked problem of climate information. What works, what doesn't, and why. So just a very quick background on Joseph. He has experience in climate change adaptation. He was the senior climate science expert in the UN Economic Commission for Africa, where he was supporting countries across Africa with their climate change and policy issues to do with climate information and early warning. And of course, Joe, she's our experienced policy research development evaluation, and has come from various multilateral organisations in the past. So let's go first, I think, to Joseph. Is that right? Or you go first? Joseph first? Okay, Joseph, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you all for coming. It's a great opportunity to have you to listen to this talk. I'll try to do justice to it. It's a very complex topic. Climate science, climate information is very complex, and I'll explain why it's complex in a minute. We realize that some of the key challenges that we have in terms of climate action is the robustness of the climate information. Because if your information is wrong, your solutions will be wrong, and you may even increase the risk that you want to minimize. And so this is a very, very important topic, and it's been one of the critical elements that has been defined within the UNFCCC process. But then, if you come to the practicality on the ground, we often see a lot of challenges in the countries, particularly when there is a disaster. And I'll use this to reflect what really happens on the ground. This is a statement that was made by one of the communities in which the disaster impacted on them, and it was captured in the media. And it states that we all know that in the recent tragedy, communication were a major problem. But then also, communities did not get enough of information. There was information, but it was not enough. They couldn't find it and did not receive adequate warning. So this summarizes the type of challenge, the challenges that goes with climate information and how it is managed and delivered when it is needed most. And so in terms of content, I'll give a bit of a background and perspective. I will look at the whole value chain of the climate services delivery in terms of the generation, management, delivery, and use of climate information. And then I will talk about integrated and comprehensive approaches, particularly looking at the global framework for climate services, which is a de facto standard that every med service and everybody generating climate information will have to move it. And then we'll give a best practice and lesson from the African SIDS, one of the projects that I've worked on. Then I'll summarize and conclude, and we can have some lively discussion. And so we know in terms of documented facts that climate-related disasters are on the rise. It is important to recognize that about 90% of all natural disasters and 90% of casualties, 70% of economic losses are due to climate-related disasters and conditions. If you look at the figures on the screen, you see the distribution in terms of economic damage by region, as well as economic damage by disaster type, and also in terms of developing and developed countries. You see on the left bottom corner, we see the impact in terms of economic losses as a percentage of GDP over the period of 1995 to 2015. So we see clearly that as a percentage of GDP, the high-income countries are more resilient compared to low-income countries, where a large percentage of their GDP goes into building and managing climate risks and disasters. But then it's important to know how climate products and services are designed and generated for adaptation planning. As a matter of fact, if we look at the decision timeline, we need specific climate information to address specific problems. You cannot use the same model for any type of climate requirements. For instance, if we look at the short-term planning and emergency preparedness, that is done within an hour in terms of a flash flood to 10 days in terms of the weather forecast. We need short-term to medium-term weather forecast. And how this is designed and delivered is very different from other timelines. If you look at the seasonal to year horizon, we normally consider medium-term operational planning, the risk assessment and management, how to better prepare for the season in terms of the seasonal monsoon and hurricane season. We need to develop what we call seasonal to downward climate products to manage that. Then if you look at the 10 years in the decadal decision timeline, we are looking at long-term strategic planning that deals with infrastructure, investment in resilience building. Then we need decadal climate trend analysis. And then more importantly, if we look at the climate change horizon, which we are most popularly associated with in terms of the negotiation that happens in the climate negotiations, which has a lot of policy implications on development, we are looking at climate change scenarios. So each decision timeline has a specific requirements, and the complexity is different per decision timeline. And it's important to also notice that as the forecast lead time becomes longer, the range of uncertainties also becomes longer. So it's more accurate to have a weather forecast than a climate scenario. But this is not a simple task. It's not trivial. Our Earth climate system is a complex dynamical system, in the sense that you cannot define specific mathematical equations to solve the problem exactly. It's very compact, it's complicated. You realize that whatever happens in one part of the globe, if given time, will impact another part of the globe. For instance, we know that part of the bushfire that happens in most of the African savannas is circulated, the particles are circulated through the climate system to the Caribbean, which exacerbate the incidence of the hurricanes. So our climate, our Earth is connected, is interconnected. So to model the climate, we need to model this as a globe. And it's very, very complicated. We need to look at the physics, which is complex in terms of the land surface. How does the land surface interact with the atmosphere? How do we capture clouds? How do we look at the atmosphere? How do we bring in the elements of the sea? And much more interaction, including human interference with the climate. And this is a very complex system. So at the moment, we don't even understand a lot of the physics. We have to use assumptions, we have to use simplification to represent the weather. And we don't even have the right computer infrastructure to provide very detailed climate extremes across the globe. So what is done is, it takes a long time to run models. It takes about an hour to over 2 to 3 years to run a climate scenario across the globe, depending on the complexity of the problem. And so we provide the global climate outlook outputs that are basically inconsistent with the adaptation scale. For instance, the output that comes out of the global climate models is about 100 kilometer resolution. But we know that in much of what we do in this year, we want to focus on the community scale, the adaptation scale. And the 100 kilometer resolution is clearly inconsistent with what we do. So the temperature of the ocean, the temperature of the land will have to be different. It has to be resolved. And the only way we can do this is to find fine scale information at the appropriate scale, where the project design and implementation will have to take place. So we use a lot of assumptions, a lot of physical concepts to take the coarse global climate model outputs, and then we add fine scale information. So if you look at the diagram, the bottom part is the global climate model output, what the IPCC will normally give out. And then we use a similar model by adding fine scale information at the land surface. You realize that if you live in a place where there are mountains and hills and valleys, the climate on top of the mountain is very different from that of the valley and that of the sea. We call it microclimate. And what is happening is that the land surface sees the same regional climate. Like if you take Asia, we have a monsoon season. Everywhere in Asia experiences monsoon. But the interaction of the land surface and the atmosphere gives you the climate at a particular location. So the information that you provide, the high resolution information that you provide, determines the accuracy of the forecast of the projection at a given place. And this is also not a simple problem. It's very, very complicated. For every resolution, well, let's say if you move from 25 kilometer resolution to 5 kilometer resolution, the computational resources increases by tenfold. So these are some of the parameters that need to be balanced to be able to realistically provide the climate information for decision making. So you could see clearly from this is a system that is developing within the Mozambican channel. And on my left side, you see the global circulation model, which seems to capture some large-scale features. But on the right-hand side, we see a high-resolution regional climate model. And it's able to resolve the stream system that is developing within the channel. So this is very, very important. The case of GCF, if we get a proposal from countries and the resolution of the models are not consistent with adaptation scale, it means systems that are developing cannot be properly captured, and our investment will go to waste. We will design suboptimal solutions that will even go to exacerbate the risk that we want to manage. So fine, robust climate information is critical in terms of designing projects for adaptation planning. And what makes a good forecast? What we will consider as a good forecast? There are three key parameters. As a matter of fact, the output are imperfect because of the uncertainties in the models and the assumptions that we make. So what we want to look at are the consistency of the forecast or the climate information. Is it in agreement with the forecaster's best judgment? For instance, at the moment we have winter, we will not expect a temperature forecast about 50 degrees Celsius. This is not consistent with what the forecaster will envisage. And then also the quality of the forecast. How does it agree with what actually happens? You have to verify the forecast to understand the quality of the forecast. And more important is the value of the forecast. The degree to which the forecast helps the decision maker to realize some incremental benefit, whether economic, social, or environmental. And this is very, very important. And so climate information has no value unless it is used. And the use of it determines the value of the forecast. And the quality of the forecast will differ from application to application. And then we come to the issues of data information management. This is so important. First, we have to manage the large information that is generated from the model output. We have to design the data systems that we will better manage. We need to provide access from users. We need to develop systems that allows access and use of the infrastructure. We need to provide other infrastructure that will enable the distribution of climate information. And more importantly also, we need to serve information. So providing access and also providing service to others who can access and use the information. And so this has been consolidated into a framework, the global framework for climate services, which has been established globally to determine how climate service delivery will have to be deployed. So every MES service that is fit for purpose should have these 5 key components. We have the governments and the policy layer on top. And then we have the user interface platform, which is like a marketplace where people buy and sell climate information, socialize around climate information. So the user interface is very, very critical to get feedback to improve the forecast. And the climate services information system is the most important component. It deals with the IT infrastructure. It allows you to do better forecasts, depending on the quality of the climate system, the climate service information system. We also have observations that are critical to drive the model. We also need to do research, modeling, and prediction to better enhance the forecast. And more importantly, capacity development, which will help us to enhance and develop the system. But we have a lot of challenges in terms of categorization of net services, in terms of functions and the service delivery. This is how WMO categorizes net services. We provide basic climate services like climate observation, data management, and interaction with users. These are basic that every net service needs to have. And then we have essential climate service, which is a category 2. And that, in addition to the basic services, you need to do what we call seasonal climate outlook, where you bring users together to socialize about the data. And then you have to do climate monitoring. You have to monitor the climate. The third category is the full climate services, where in addition to the category 2, you also do specialized climate products, which is private sector innovation, aviation meteorology, and other aspects of climate services. And also do decadal climate product and prediction. And then we have the advanced, which is the category 4, which in addition to that, you have the long-term climate projections, customized climate products, and climate application tools. So the advanced climate services categories are those in the world that provide what we call the global producing centers that develop the tools and the methods that are used in climate modeling and analysis. But now let's look at some of the challenges. If you look at the complexity of the problem and the categorization of the net service, I'm taking a survey that was done by WMO Africa. And these are the responses for the net services. In Africa, over 88% of the net services are challenged in delivering climate products and services. 92% lack appropriate application software. 96 need upgrading of their operational infrastructure. 92 need technical training and production of climate services. And more importantly, 85% say lack of effective coordination among agencies impacts on the way they deliver climate services. So these are really striking statistics. And so this calls for a shift in paradigm in terms of how we deliver climate services and support to countries. I will provide one best practice that I was involved in, where we looked at African states. The challenge in the African states is that the resolution of the module that is provided to them is the same as that of the mainland. And some of the islands are like 10 kilometers. So we realize that until we provide a system that is realistic to the challenges of the unique requirements of the islands, we'll not be able to support them to better address the issues of climate variability and change. So we developed, on the tight budget, we looked at open source tools, put together a system that allows each of the islands in Africa to have 1 kilometer high resolution climate information that helps to better manage the extreme events. And also we went ahead to look at a Pan-African model with this 10 kilometer resolution. And this is the first time that the system has been deployed across Africa. In the case of Cabo Verde, where for the first time in 100 years, they had a hurricane that went through Cabo Verde. And this was one of the models that helped them to better predict the fine-scale resolution of the streams within the islands of the island of Cabo Verde. So by using an innovative approach, we were able to define 3 resolutions. One for the islands, which is a 1 kilometer resolution. Another for Madagascar, which is a bigger island, which is not a SIP, a bigger island, with 5 kilometer resolution. And then the continent of Africa, which had 9 kilometer resolution, which is against 50 kilometer resolution, what that was being used. And so this was very innovational. This was very transformational because we use open source tools, very cheap technology, and a tight budget of less than $300,000 to provide something that would cost over $3 to $5 million per net service. But we use about 300 to cover the whole of Africa. And the trick here is about IT revolution. The IT infrastructure is becoming cheap and powerful, that you could build systems that you could not have done in the past. So the difference between a developed country net service and a developing country net service is actually the digital divide. If you get good infrastructure, you have a lot of open source tools. And the knowledge which is common to all now, you can develop a very good system. So this is how we demonstrate that you can make climate information widely available by using cheap, inexpensive tools and methods that allows countries to meet their specific needs. And how is this combined? Climate information is not the only input for decision making when it comes to disasters. It has to blend with other inputs to make it more effective. So we have to develop risk knowledge systems. We need to do monitoring and warning service, which is done through the National Climate Information. We need to disseminate and communicate the information to the communities, the right form of information, and we need to build a response capability. How do we build capability of the communities to react to the information and the warning service that is given to them? So in summary, I would say that the whole enterprise needs to rethink. What we need to do is to support countries to develop integrated and comprehensive approaches to climate services using the global framework that provides the ability to articulate how service delivery should be done. Data will have to be robust. We need to build robust data, information and knowledge management systems so that they can design better products. If you look at the case of DCA, this is one of the things we have to do to make sure that the information that is needed for robust adaptation planning is accessible to the countries. And more importantly, also participatory interaction to involve all the stakeholders in the definition of the problem and then developing the solution. We call this co-design and co-production. This is very important for countries or for communities to accept your information. They have to trust you. And trust comes through collaboration. When you work together, design a system and generate it out. And we find this to be very, very effective. And of course, innovative technologies are important. The IT revolution is transforming the way we do climate services. Using a very simple system, we can create a lot of innovative solutions that can help and inform the decision making. And so I think I will end here and then give the floor. Okay.
Sorry, Joe, are you going next, or
Yeah.
you're gonna? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Neil, for doing this for us, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I also want to acknowledge Professor Lee from CIDE at Seoul National University, who's here with his team. We're going to be talking to them and engaging with them and partnering with them. BIU is going to be doing that, and we're going to be discussing a potential partnership later today. So thank you so much for coming. It's really my privilege to be here. For those of you who don't know, I'm Joe. I head the Independent Evaluation Unit. And I'm going to take off where Joseph left off, essentially, to essentially indicate that, yes, we have this big problem. The World Bank produced a really good report a few years ago where the WMO estimated that climate services information infrastructure, just the infrastructure, was approximated at that point, and which is about 10 years ago, by $10 billion. But really, climate information services is essentially a problem of communication and of communicating probabilities. And we all at the GCF are familiar with that problem. So I'm going to try and see what we are finding out from the evidence, but also try and put some questions to all of you and to Joseph to try and see how we can take this discipline forward. Oh, sorry. If you haven't read The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, please do it. It's a wonderful book which talks about the sixth extinction that we are witnessing today as a consequence of anthropogenic emissions. Okay. So very quickly, again, I'm talking about disaster risk communications that help to prevent harm from disasters, mitigate harm from disasters, reduce losses, economic, social, and/or environmental, and prepare a population before a disaster. And what has happened traditionally in this space is a lot of the calculations about the cost of the cost of damages from disasters are calculated using what's called hedonic pricing, willingness to pay, cost of averted disaster models, as well as a whole lot of other things. So the World Bank, for example, has estimated that the returns to investing in disaster communications is about 4:1. But it's clear that that depends on, modeling exercises that we all adopt that are fairly limited. So just to give you an example, they use a lot of these modeling exercises that calculate the losses and therefore the benefits of climate information services are really restricted to understanding what individual values are of infrastructure loss and what individual damages are. They fail to take on board things that are not, accepted by the market or in the market. They fail to take on board what are more social and public goods and amenity values that might be there. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. What is important also to notice and to highlight is that the timing of climate information can be varied, right? So you can think about it as being provided before an event is to occur, and then an event occurs, and so you would calculate what are called disaster-related losses. You could calculate it ex post, and then calculate the cost of providing relief, and that could be therefore the benefits or averted costs that you would have really benefited from, and so could help to calculate the returns to climate information. You could also calculate the cost of restoring to baseline, but you could also calculate how much it takes to stay along a certain trajectory of development. So these are all various ways of calculating what the returns to these services are. All of this is fine and very well, but when we looked at a review of disaster risk communications, and this was done in 2014, and when we looked at this, we found that, okay, so if you look through all of the databases that provide really good quality evaluations and studies of whether disaster risk communications are working or not, your first hits are about 5,000 odd studies. But what really make the cut to make you understand whether this evidence is rigorous or not is only 25. And this is still pretty limited. This review was only looking at evidence in developed countries. And in developed countries, we do presume that a lot of this evidence is far better put together than in developing countries. The important part is to recognize what the overall and fairly basic theory of change is. So essentially, I've taken what Joseph presented and put it into a very, very simple theory of change. The NMHS abbreviation, for those of you who don't know, that Joseph used is the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services, essentially the infrastructure that is put together to then provide information services. And these are fairly expensive and extensive. But essentially, the beginning is that you put together these information services. Communications are then put out about weather and or climate, depending on what timeline you're thinking about. It reaches the intended audience, yeah? And then that leads to a change in knowledge and or beliefs. That then changes behavior of not just individuals, but also communities, of businesses, of planners, of policymakers. Adaptation expenditures therefore to take place. That's definitely the assumption. And then this has sort of beneficial impacts on the economy, the environment, and social. All very good. The important part is to recognize that where agencies and organizations have some control over are in the first two cubes of this very simple theory of change. So the efficacy of the kind of information that you put out, which is it good, is it correct, is it timely? You have quite a bit of control. Agencies have a lot of control over that. And the modeling is expensive. It requires capacity, not just at the individual level, but also at the infrastructure level. And that's what Joseph was talking about, the infrastructure that you put together and the enabling environment. But this is essentially the first two cubes of the theory of change. And most organizations on the supply side have a pretty decent amount of control over this, right? You also have, to a lesser extent, but you also have some control on the types of messages that go out. That's also okay. Where control starts to sort of dwindle is
how much of the intended audience you're reaching. And reaching is not just supplying to, but essentially that they are reading or understanding the messages as you intended them to send them, right? And there it starts to become less green, right? And so green is good for me. And then after that, it goes into a space where you presume that that's going to change their beliefs, their knowledge, and that will lead to changes in investment behavior, in infrastructure behavior. All of that is happening basically on that linkage. And for me, that linkage, that arrow, is the most important one. Yeah, it's essentially the last mile problem. Because unless all of this is very good, we can keep putting out messages, communications, etc. But unless this last mile happens, nothing is going to be transformational. We can get, so all of it is supply driven, but we're not going to see the change that we want to see, right? So then clearly knowledge is not enough. And to what extent are we then seeing a change in behavior? And we started to then examine this question in previous work, but I want to illustrate this very quickly from a space that you would expect would react to good evidence and good knowledge pretty quickly. And this is the medical space, right? So doctors know, for example, that they need to sanitize hands. That's pretty simple. But in a study that was done in the early 2000s in the United States, it was found that as a consequence of doctors not sanitizing their hands, there were 100,000 deaths. 100,000 deaths in a year because doctors don't sanitize their hands. So they're going to go into a surgery room, they have to take off their gloves, they have to wash their hands. They don't wash their hands, they essentially keep their gloves on, take off their gloves, wear new gloves. But as you take off your gloves, your hands get dirty, and that's how diseases get transmitted. And they don't wash, and they wear new gloves again, but they don't sanitize again. So researchers at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine then worked with Imperial College and a few others to try and see what can be done. Clearly, doctors of all people in the world should know that they should sanitize their hands. They don't. What can be done to induce this behavior? They put hand sanitizers at the entrances of surgery rooms. So hand sanitizers, yeah, they worked. About 15% change in hand sanitizing behavior. But clearly not enough if you're talking about 100,000 deaths in 1 year alone, right? So they then worked with a few other things. And all of you are aware that Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize this year in economics. He worked with what are called behavioral insights, right? And behavioral insights is a space where you're really trying to think of how human beings behave. We all work, we all get up in the morning, brush our teeth, etc. That's the automatic part of our brain. That's system one thinking. There's also system two thinking. That is much more deliberate. You're planning a holiday. That's much more deliberate, and you think about it much more. Doctors are behaving from one side of their brain, and they're thinking very automatically. How do you influence that? How do you change that behavior? Because that's what is happening in climate information as well. People continue to be inertial. How do you change that behavior? So they tried a few things. They put, in one case, they put on top of these sanitizers, they put men's eyes. Just, men, people are looking at you. Come and wash your hands. Hey, they also put women's eyes. Then they did something else. They sprayed a lemon scent. So think of the antibacterial soap that you use. That has a lemon scent to it. It triggers something in your brain. Yeah? And then they tried to compare it with the control group. The control group that just had access to the hand sanitizer, but nothing else. Yeah? And these are the results they found. Okay, so when just women's eyes were put, so just a 22% change, but if you compare it with the control group, it's essentially a 7% change, yeah, over your control. Clearly, women looking doesn't matter. Okay, men's eyes, 33 over the 15% control group. So that's like a double, but still it's 33%. See what happens when you come and spray a scent. The lemon scent in your brain then triggers the reminder that you've got to sanitize your hands. This has now been done over and over again. You go into restaurants, they've tried spraying a lemon scent, people will clean the tables before they leave. Their own tables, yeah? So the waiters don't have to do it. It works. So you clearly have to think about what changes behavior. So this is sort of the space that we have to think about when we are thinking about transformative change, when we are thinking about systemic change, when we are thinking about paradigm shifts. Because clearly you're providing information, but information supply is not going to be it. So we then looked at other literature, bed nets. Everyone knows that you should be using bed nets appropriately. If you go into Africa, and we've done studies on these evaluative studies that have found, yes, distribution of bed nets is fantastic, 100% bed net distribution. Usage in the correct way of bed nets is 25%, even though there are demonstrations that are